There are evenings when Oxford seems to hum, not with youth or learning, but with the faint vibration of something older, a note too low for the living ear. I remember such a night, damp and faintly luminous, when the bells of Magdalen had ceased, and only the sound of rain remained, striking the parapets like the hesitant rehearsal of some forgotten requiem. I had gone, without purpose or invitation, to hear the choir at St. Barnabas. A man might pretend to love sacred music for its order, but I loved it for its grief, that secret willingness to break one's own heart for beauty. The boys sang as though they were whispering into eternity, unaware that eternity rarely listens. Beside me, a woman in a dark green coat wiped her eyes, though the hymn was not a sad one. There is a certain kind of devotion that has nothing to do with God. After the service, I lingered beneath the dripping gargoyles, lighting a cigarette that tasted, as they always did, of unfinished resolutions. Lewis waited in the car, no doubt wondering how long a man could stand still in the rain without appearing mad. He needn't have worried. I've often suspected madness is merely the faculty of noticing too much. When I finally joined him, he remarked on the lateness of the hour, and I replied with some evasive remark about insomnia, which was true enough. He drove, as always, too cautiously, the wipers smearing rather than clearing the view. Somewhere near Jericho, a light flickered in a music school window, a single figure bent over a piano. A minor key, I thought, before realizing I could not hear a note. The following morning the summons came. A porter's wife at St. Jude's College had found a man collapsed in the chapel vestry. Dead, apparently, though she'd first assumed him drunk. The description, late 40s, academic gown, still damp from the night, would not have surprised me had it not been for the name Dr. Leonard Greaves, Fellow in Theology, occasional lecturer in musical aesthetics, and, as it happened, conductor of the St. Barnabas Choir. It is a strange thing to learn of death through familiarity of tone rather than shock of fact. I recalled the tilt of his head as he conducted as though leaning toward a truth he could almost hear. The chapel was cold, its air thick with polish and disuse. Greaves lay beneath the organ loft, his hand outstretched toward the hymnals. Someone had covered his face with a cassock, though not entirely. The porter muttered about heart failure, and I nodded, though I was studying the hymn book that had fallen beside him. The page was open to The Choir Invisible, a small, unremarkable poem by George Eliot, yet the ink upon the margin was newly smudged by damp fingers. I read the line, "May I join the choir invisible of those immortal dead who live again in minds made better by their presence." It struck me as too deliberate, too placed. Lewis asked if I thought it was suicide. I said no, though I could not have told him why. Outside, the rain had softened into a mist, and the sound of distant bells wove itself through the quadrangle like a half-remembered promise. I noticed a single umbrella leaning against the wall, ivory-handled, the initials LG faintly engraved upon the ferrule. The clasp was broken, yet the fabric was dry. Someone had placed it there after the storm had passed. Lewis fetched the college secretary, a woman with neat shoes and a voice that seemed perpetually rehearsed. She said Dr. Greaves had dismissed the choir early last night, citing exhaustion. No one had seen him leave. When I asked if he'd been troubled, she hesitated, then said, "Only by music, Inspector, only ever by that." There was a silence between us, then the kind that feels like the shadow of another conversation. I thanked her and turned back toward the vestry. The hymn book was still open, its pages trembling slightly in the draught. I bent and closed it, though not before noticing a faint indentation on the wood beneath a ring, perhaps, left by a chalice or a glass, a circle of absence. That night, alone in my flat on North Parade, I poured a whiskey and tried to recall the exact timbre of the choir's final note. It eluded me, as all important things do. Still, I could not rid myself of the thought that somewhere, in the echoing corridors of St. Jude's, one voice had continued after the others had fallen silent. It was the chaplain who discovered it, or rather, who claimed to. Such men are often drawn to the theatre of revelation, mistaking their own astonishment for divine providence. He had been polishing the lectern, he said, when the psalter slipped open of its own accord, releasing a small folded letter that had lain hidden between the pages of the penitential psalms. He had not read it, naturally. He had only glimpsed the writing, the cream of the paper, the red wax already cracked from age or carelessness. He had, of course, summoned me. I remember the smell of the chapel, that mixture of dust, damp hymnals, and the slow decay of faith. It was morning, a grey one, the sort that blurs the distinction between smoke and mist. I stood where Greaves had fallen, my shoes faintly echoing against the stone floor. The letter lay upon the altar, sealed once, now torn, its contents folded back with a hesitancy that suggested second thoughts. The handwriting was deliberate, thin, educated, and unmistakably female. It began without greeting, as though continuing a conversation interrupted by fear. The first line read, "If you have already chosen silence, then let this be my final hymn." I read it once. Then again, there was no name, no date, no reference to the writer's identity, only the intimation of reproach, a tone balanced between devotion and accusation. Lewis watched me read, his patience wrapped in that faintly bovine curiosity I found both infuriating and necessary. He asked if I thought it was a lover's letter. I told him that all letters are, in some way. It was the mention of hymns that caught me. The writer had underlined it. Beneath, she had written, "You told me once that faith is only another name for waiting." I am tired of both. The pen had pressed too hard into the paper, leaving a faint ridge. The sort of indentation one makes when trying not to cry. The chaplain spoke softly behind me, suggesting perhaps it had been left long ago, forgotten. But the ink was fresh, the edges unsunned. Someone had hidden it recently and with care. I asked when last the psalter had been moved, and he frowned, as though the question itself were a trespass. It had been used during last Sunday's evensong, he said. The choir had sung Psalm 51, "Have mercy upon me, O God." Greaves, then, had read from this very book. The notion settled uneasily. Lewis had taken to pacing by the pews, glancing now and then at the chapel's stained glass. A figure of St. Cecilia watched us through fractured light. I noticed how the colours shifted over the stone red, bleeding into violet, violet into blue. It occurred to me that beauty often survives its purpose. I slipped the letter into an evidence envelope, though evidence seemed too crude a word. It was, more properly, an echo, the kind that lingers when sound has gone. Later in Greaves's rooms, I sat by his desk, the letter before me. His shelves were orderly, his papers less so. On the mantelpiece stood a small photograph of the choir in rehearsal, the faces blurred slightly as though caught mid-breath. Among them, a woman's outline, turning away from the camera. I would not have noticed it if not for the reflection of light across the glass, catching the curve of her hand resting upon the organ railing. A ring, silver, narrow, unadorned, glinted faintly. Lewis brought me tea, lukewarm and overbrewed. He said he'd found nothing of interest in the wastepaper bin. I asked him if he'd checked the back of it. He hadn't. Beneath the lining, folded flat, was a scrap of music manuscript, a single bar written in Greaves's neat notation. It matched the opening of a hymn I had heard only the night before. The choir invisible. It was no deduction worth boasting of, only a coincidence perhaps, yet something in it troubled me. The idea that he had been revising that particular hymn after finding the letter, or because of it, seemed plausible enough. But there was another possibility that the letter had been written after his death by someone who wished to speak to him still. The Psalter remained on my desk for days afterward. I would glance at it as one glances at a word one half remembers from a crossword, knowing the meaning is close, just out of reach. I often thought of that phrase faith as waiting and wondered if the woman who wrote it had understood, as I did then, that the dead have the advantage of never having to explain themselves. When I returned the Psalter to the chapel, the air was still, the candles half burned. I placed it upon the lectern and watched the dust rise from its cover. Somewhere beyond the cloisters a bell began to toll. I counted the strokes, 11, always one short of midnight. She appeared first, not as a suspect, but as an echo. I had seen her face in the choir photograph, half-turned, the light grazing her cheek as though reluctant to commit her to permanence. When I met her days later in the music school practice room, she seemed at once older and younger than I'd imagined a woman whose beauty had survived through resignation, not vanity. Her name, she said, was Marianne. She did not offer a surname, and I did not ask for one. The piano behind her was open, though untouched, its ivory keys yellowed like old teeth. On the stand rested a sheet of notation, the same hymn Greaves had been working on, copied by another hand. I remember thinking how music, like guilt, can be easily transcribed but never truly repeated. Lewis had introduced us awkwardly, his manner caught between courtesy and suspicion. She smiled at him in that distant way some women do when they know men are out of their depth. Then she turned her gaze to me, not quite directly, as if she were examining the air between us for meaning. "You're the inspector," she said, though it sounded less like a question than an accusation. I told her we were investigating Dr. Greaves's death. She nodded once, almost approvingly, and began to gather the scattered music sheets on the table. Each bore small annotations in pencil fragments of words, notations of breath and silence. I asked if she had written them. She said they were his, but she had taught him to listen differently. The phrase lingered to listen differently. I asked her what she meant, and she said that music, properly heard, reveals not what is present, but what is missing. It struck me as a truth that applied to most of life. Lewis, sensing perhaps that our conversation had drifted beyond his reach, excused himself to inspect the corridor. Marianne watched him leave, then sat at the piano. Her fingers hovered, uncertain, above the keys. When she played, it was not the hymn, but a fragment of something older back. I think, though bent strangely, a phrase inverted and repeated until it began to sound like an argument with itself. When she stopped, the silence seemed heavier than the sound had been. She said softly that Leonard called him, that had come to her less for music than for mercy, that he believed his work with the choir was a kind of redemption, though he would never say from what. I asked if she had written to him recently. She met my eyes then and said, "Not recently enough." Her hands trembled slightly, and I noticed the silver ring narrow, unadorned, the same one from the photograph. It gleamed faintly beneath the lamp, a cold circle of continuity. I asked about the letter found in the Psalter. She closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing herself against a long-expected blow. Then she said she had written many letters, some sent, some not. But if he received one. She hoped he had understood it, not as reproach, but release. There was in her voice a tone I could not quite define, not sorrow, not guilt, but something lonelier. a kind of exhaustion that comes only after too much waiting. She said that Greaves had asked her once to sing again for the choir, but she had refused. It was not vanity, she said, simply that her voice had changed. I left her then with a politeness that felt insufficient. Outside, the air was sharp with the faint tang of rain. Lewis asked what I thought. I told him that the woman had loved him, not romantically perhaps, but through that dangerous intimacy born of shared silence. He said he didn't follow. I said that was precisely the problem. That evening I sat in my flat with the hymn before me, humming the melody under my breath. Somewhere between the second and third verse, a phrase stood out, a single note marked Adagio sempre, always slowly. It was written in her hand, not his. I thought then of what she'd said, that music reveals what is missing, and I began to wonder if the missing voice in that hymn had been her own. There was no proof, only that instinct which comes too late to be useful. I poured a whiskey and let the glass rest against my temple. Outside, a lone violin drifted from the street below, practicing a piece I couldn't place. The same phrase over and over, until it no longer sounded like music at all, but like memory rehearsing its own defeat. It was Lewis who first mentioned the reunion. He had found a notice pinned to the board outside the porter's lodge, a gathering of the St. Jude's choir, those boys now grown into middle-aged men, summoned to commemorate Dr. Greaves's years of service. I told him it was indecently soon, though Oxford has a way of turning grief into ceremony before the body is properly cold. He shrugged, said they were only singing, and I wondered if he knew how little difference that made. They met in the old refectory. The long oak tables had been cleared, replaced by rows of chairs facing the dais. At the centre stood the same worn lectern from the chapel, as if continuity could absolve absence. I arrived uninvited, or rather without having to ask. People assume the police belong everywhere. Tragedy once lingered. When the singing began, I stood at the back. Their voices were rougher now, worn by time and tobacco. But when they reached the harmonies, something pure broke through. The sound rose and settled in the rafters like trapped light. I closed my eyes briefly and thought of the hymn Greaves had loved the choir invisible. Afterward I found myself beside one of them, a quiet man with thinning hair and a manner of reluctant confidence. He said his name was Peterson. He had been head chorister once, he told me, and Greaves had favoured him, though not in the way rumour sometimes suggests. He smiled at that, but the smile did not last. He said Greaves had been a man of contradictions, both devout and doubtful, tender yet exacting. He remembered one rehearsal when the organ had failed mid-hymn, and Greaves, instead of stopping, had continued conducting the silence. It was, he said, the finest music they ever made. There was a pause then, and I saw his eyes drift toward the far end of the room, where Marianne stood, speaking with the chaplain. She was dressed in black, of course, though her hands, gloveless, betrayed her through their movement, restless, almost apologetic. Peterson followed my gaze and said quietly that she had been there before any of them, helping Greaves with arrangements. Helping, I repeated, and he nodded once, as if the word were both true and incomplete. Lewis joined us then, clutching 2 cups of weak tea. He said he'd spoken with another of the choir, a man named Rourke, who remembered a disagreement between Greaves and the bursar some weeks before his death. Something about funding for the music department. I asked what sort of disagreement, but Lewis had already forgotten the details. He said he'd look into it, though we both knew he would not find much. Money leaves fewer clues than music. It was Peterson who offered the smallest, sharpest detail, almost absent-mindedly, as though recalling a line of verse. He said that during rehearsals Greaves had always insisted on keeping the vestry door locked, said it improved the acoustics. I asked if it did. He smiled faintly. No, but it kept people from coming in unannounced. Later, as the men dispersed, I lingered in the refectory. The air had grown still, heavy with the scent of polish and damp wool. I walked to the lectern. The Psalter lay open again, not to the penitential psalms this time, but to Psalm 137. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? The page bore a faint watermark, circular and uneven, left perhaps by a glass or a candle. It matched the ring I'd seen on the vestry floor that first morning, the same absence repeating itself. Outside, rain began again, soft and persistent. Lewis said it would ruin the roads home, and I told him it didn't matter. But as we walked to the car, I couldn't help turning back once more. Through the window, the last of the choir lingered, their laughter thin, uncertain. I thought how strange it is that men will sing more freely for the dead than ever they did for the living. When I reached home, I found myself humming the melody under my breath, a phrase I couldn't place, though it carried the same weary beauty I'd heard in that room. Perhaps it was Greaves's final lesson that music endures, not because it is remembered, but because it refuses to stop haunting. It was late afternoon when I returned to the chapel. The winter light, slanted and unforgiving, entered through the stained glass, as if embarrassed by its own intrusion. Dust motes drifted in the stillness, the air thick with the scent of wax and rain-soaked stone. A psalm book lay open upon the lectern, its pages lifting faintly with each breath of wind that slipped beneath the door, as though someone unseen were still turning them. I had not meant to come. I had promised Lewis I would take the evening off, yet found myself walking instinctively back through the quad, past the cloisters where puddles mirrored fragments of a greying sky. Habit, perhaps, or guilt. The distinction had grown indistinct of late. The choir's absence was louder than their singing had ever been. The benches, still marked by the impressions of last night's gathering, carried that faint residual warmth that lingers after the ceremony. I stood where Greaves once stood, beneath the organ pipes that reached upward like the ribs of some ancient cathedral creature. Something caught my eye, a page torn from a notebook, folded small and tucked between the Psalter and the Book of Common Prayer. I lifted it carefully. On it were a few lines of music, sketched hastily, and beneath them a phrase in Greaves's hand, Ad te levavi animum meam. To thee, O Lord, I lift up my soul. It was not the Latin that troubled me, but the ink faintly smeared, as though touched before it had dried. Someone else's hand, perhaps, laid upon it after the writing. Lewis arrived then, his coat unbuttoned, a trace of cold following him. He said he'd been with the bursar. No argument over money, after all just an awkward question of accounts and priorities. Greaves had wanted more funding for the choir library the bursar had refused. Nothing fatal, Lewis said. I agreed, though I knew better. The fatal things are rarely dramatic. They come quietly, through years of slight humiliations and half-felt despairs. He asked what I was looking at. I told him it was only music, though even as I spoke I noticed the curious slant of the treble clef, the hesitation in the quaver. Greaves's usual hand was precise. This one faltered. I remembered then something Marianne had said, that his hearing had begun to betray him. Not completely, just enough that the notes blurred like words overheard through water. Lewis wandered toward the choir stalls, whistling tunelessly, his voice echoing off the stone. He asked if I'd ever sung in a choir. I told him I didn't have the temperament for harmony. He said nothing, and for a moment I heard only the ticking of his watch and the faint drip of water from the roof. As he left to fetch the verger, I remained, studying the folded page. The phrase Ad te levavi animam meum returned to me, and I recalled that it was from Psalm 25, not one of Greaves's usual selections. The psalm begins in faith, but ends in pleading. Redeem Israel, O God, out of all his troubles. Perhaps that was what Greaves had meant, that redemption, like music, depends on the willingness to sustain a note beyond its comfort. A movement in the shadows startled me, then not sound exactly, but a shift in the colour of the air. From the vestry door emerged Marianne. She did not seem surprised to see me. She said she had come to collect a score she had left behind, though she made no move toward the shelves. Her eyes lingered on the lectern, and when she saw the page in my hand, she smiled faintly, a smile so brief it might have been imagined. She said quietly that Greaves had been working on a new arrangement before he died, something incomplete, a psalm half-sung. I asked if she had heard it. She nodded once. Just once, she said, but it was enough. I wanted to ask what she meant, but she was already walking away, her footsteps soft against the flagstones. When she was gone, I placed the page back where I'd found it. It seemed right that it should remain unfinished, suspended in its uncertainty. Later that night in my flat, I took out an old crossword I'd left half done. One clue caught my eye. Hymn of Contrition 5. The answer, of course, was psalm, but beside the word I noticed a faint smudge, a correction I hadn't made. Half, written in the margin. I stared at it for a long while. A psalm half sung. The thought seemed to gather weight in the silence. Some prayers, I suppose, are never meant to end. They just fade, unresolved, like music reaching for the note that won't come. There are certain keys, I've always thought, that refuse consolation. C minor is one of them, too solemn for innocence, too honest for sentiment. It was Greaves's key of choice, the one he turned to whenever his thoughts grew troubled. I knew this not through confession, but through the pattern of the funeral hymns he arranged, the student compositions he annotated, the quiet moments at the organ when, believing himself alone, he returned to that same tonal sadness. It was Lewis who first remarked that the college organ had been recently tuned. He said it casually while leafing through the tuner's invoice. Routine work, he thought. But something in me caught on the date, 3 days before Greaves died. I remembered the folded sheet of music in the psalter, the blurred notes, the trembling quaver. A man cannot write clearly if his instrument betrays him. We returned to St. Jude's that afternoon. The organist, a pale young fellow with hands too delicate for his trade, met us in the loft. He spoke softly, reverently, as if every word might disturb the pipes. He told us Greaves had been insistent about the tuning, almost obsessive. He'd sat beside the tuner, testing each note, though his face had gone grey from the cold. When I asked what they'd played, the boys said variations in C minor, Greaves's own composition. I asked if he still had the score. The boy hesitated, then fetched a folder from the cupboard. The pages were neat, the title penciled in Greaves's careful script, but the final variation of the 7th stopped abruptly, mid-bar. The ink had trailed, as though his hand had faltered or withdrawn. Beneath, in faint graphite, someone had written one word, listen. Lewis peered over my shoulder, his brow furrowing. He said it was probably a note to himself. I said perhaps, though I'd never known Greaves, to need reminding. The boy watched us both uneasily, as if sensing we were trespassing in a place where reason had little authority. Later, as we descended the narrow staircase, Lewis asked what I made of it. I told him that unfinished music is rarely about error, it's a confession. He said I was growing fanciful, and I didn't disagree. In the quadrangle below, the rain had begun again, that fine, needling kind that blurs reflections into ghosts. The chapel door was ajar. I entered, drawn, not by purpose, but by habit. The air was thick with the residue of incense. On the lectern lay the psalter, closed this time. I noticed a faint smudge of wax along its spine candle grease, perhaps but fresh. Someone had been there since morning. The organ pipes loomed above, their mouths dark, expectant. I sat in the front pew and listened. It is strange how easily one can imagine a single chord, unresolved, vibrating faintly in the skull long after it should have ceased. I thought again of that word, listen. When I returned to my office, I found Marianne waiting. She said she had come to return a key, the chapel key. It lay on the table between us, the brass dulled by touch. She spoke little, and I less. I asked if she'd known of Greaves's final composition. Her eyes flickered. He called it his repentance, she said, though not for any sin I could name. Then she added, almost absently, that he'd once said every man hears God in a different key. After she left, I poured a whiskey and stared at the key for a long time. Repentance, in C minor. The phrase lingered like smoke. It was late when Lewis telephoned. He said the tuner had confirmed something odd. The lowest pipe had been deliberately stopped, stuffed with a small wad of folded paper. He'd removed it, a letter of sorts, unsigned, half dissolved by condensation. Only a few words were legible. She sang the wrong note. I replaced the receiver slowly. She. The pronoun felt heavy, unanswerable. That night, unable to sleep, I unfolded Greaves's score once more. The final unfinished bar seemed to lean toward resolution and F, perhaps, leading to the tonic that never came. I played it softly on my old piano, the sound wavering in the stillness. At the end, I allowed my hand to fall, leaving the phrase open, incomplete. Outside, the rain had stopped. From somewhere distant, perhaps the river, came the faint cry of a night bird, a single, plaintive note. I thought of Greaves, of his last composition, and of the strange insistence in that penciled word, listen. So I did, for a long time, to nothing at all. The letter arrived without ceremony, slid beneath my office door sometime after dusk. No envelope, only a folded sheet of thick vellum, the kind the colleges use for invitations and secrets. The handwriting was immaculate, the kind of hand that belonged to a man who never wrote in haste and who never doubted the importance of his own words. It read, simply, "You will find your answers in the accounts the benefactor. Seek the silence, not the song." I knew the phrasing at once. Greaves's old benefactor, Sir Alaric Ventham, whose name lingered on the chapel plaques and bursary lists like a ghost too wealthy to exercise. His donations had rebuilt half the music school and silenced twice as many inquiries about their origin. Silence, indeed, was his greatest contribution. Lewis found me later that evening at the Randolph Bar, where I'd taken to sitting without company, staring at the amber light through my glass as though time itself were dissolving inside it. He said he'd spoken with the bursar again, who'd confirmed that the late Sir Alaric's foundation still funded the choir, a stipend renewed annually and without question. I asked who signed the cheques now. He hesitated. "Lady Ventham," he said, though she rarely came to Oxford. We drove out to her estate the next morning, past the fog-thick hedgerows and the silent spires fading in the mirror. The house, when we reached it, was less a home than a mausoleum of privilege, symmetrical, immaculate, lifeless. Lady Ventham received us in a drawing-room lined with portraits of men in robes and women without expression. She was beautiful once, I thought, though beauty had hardened into something more durable composure. She said she'd known Dr. Greaves, of course, that he had been a great admirer of her late husband's patronage. Her tone carried no affection, only fatigue. I asked whether she'd seen him recently. She said she had not, then corrected herself. Once, a few weeks before his death, he'd visited to discuss an annual concert in the benefactor's name. He'd seemed, she said, unusually distracted. Lewis asked if her husband had ever taken an interest in music himself. She smiled at that thin, humorless curve. Only in its ability to make men dependent, she replied. Then she asked, almost idly, whether we thought Greaves had taken his own life. I said I was not sure. It was the truth, though I disliked how easily it sounded like a lie. When we left, she gave me a parting gift, a copy of the concert programme from the previous year. It bore Greaves's dedication to Sir Alaric, written in Latin. I translated it later, alone to the man whose silence made the music possible. That line disturbed me. Silenced again. The same word as in the anonymous note. I looked closer. The ink was faintly different from the rest of the programme, as though added later. Greaves's own handwriting, but older, shakier, perhaps done in a moment of rueful irony. Back in Oxford, I went through the bursar's ledgers, tracing the benefactor's donations. They were generous, consistent, but one entry stood apart, a transfer to Marianne Holt, dated the previous year, marked as honorarium for services rendered. Lewis thought little of it. I thought about everything. That night, I visited the chapel once more. The candles burned low, the air closed with the smell of old wax. I sat where Greaves had sat, beside the organ bench, and imagined the weight of money pressing against faith. Benefactors, I thought, demand their own hymns, the kind sung in whispers, the kind no congregation hears. There was a sound then, faint, deliberate. A footstep? No, a page turning somewhere behind me. I turned, but the aisle was empty. Only the wind, perhaps, moving through the cracks of that ancient door. Still I walked toward the vestry. On the table lay a sheet of music I had not seen before. The ink was still drying. It bore Greaves's unmistakable hand, the same looping script, variation, date, silence. There were no notes beneath the title. Only a single rest extended across the bar line. Lewis arrived moments later, apologizing for his lateness. He said he'd been checking something at the college office. The bursar, it seemed, had resigned that afternoon without explanation. He'd left behind a single envelope addressed to me. Inside a cheque, unsigned, and a short message. The music must end somewhere. I remember saying nothing. The rain had started again outside, a soft percussion against the stained glass. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him I didn't know, though in truth I suspected it was not meant for me at all. I stayed in the chapel long after he left, listening to the rhythm of water, to the absence that followed every echo. The benefactor's silence, I thought, had outlasted every note of Greaves's music. Perhaps that was his intention. Or perhaps, as with most men of means, he simply preferred not to hear what he had paid for. The storm had passed, though Oxford still smelt of rain, that mixture of wet limestone and exhausted leaves that belongs only to old cities and older regrets. By morning, the river had risen, slow and brown and indifferent, lapping at the banks beneath Folly Bridge. I stood there a while, watching the current. It seemed to move with more purpose than I felt. Lewis found me at my desk later that day, a manila folder in his hand and that expression of reluctant discovery which always precedes bad news. He said he'd been through the choir's records, the attendance logs, the bursary notes. A simple enough exercise, he thought. Yet one name appeared inconsistently, first as a tenor, later as a baritone, and then not at all. Matthew Rourke. I remembered him from the reunion as a quiet man, with the soft voice of someone accustomed to harmonizing rather than leading. Lewis said Rourke had left the choir 2 years ago under personal circumstances. No one had thought to ask what those were. Oxford's politeness is the enemy of curiosity. We found him that afternoon in a terraced house near Cowley, its curtains drawn against the weak light. He opened the door halfway, as though conversation were a trespass he might still refuse. When I mentioned Greaves, he closed it again for a long moment, then reopened it and gestured us in without speaking. The room smelt of turpentine and neglect. Sheet music littered the floor, stained with tea rings. A metronome ticked steadily in the corner, marking time for a silence that had long since learned to keep pace. Rourke said he hadn't seen Greaves in months. I said that wasn't quite true, and waited. He sighed. Yes, he'd come by the chapel the week before it happened. No, it wasn't an argument, just music. He hesitated there, the ellipsis heavy. When pressed, he said Greaves had wanted him to rejoin the choir for a special performance, a psalm, rewritten, something new. But Rourke had refused. He said he'd had enough of singing other men's confessions. It was then I noticed the manuscript on his desk, a composition in his own hand titled Divisio, a choir divided. The coincidence struck me as more than coincidence. I asked if I might see it. He shook his head. Not finished, he said. It never will be. Lewis asked if he'd known Marianne Holt. A faint twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed recognition. Everyone knew her, he said, but no one quite knew what she wanted. Greaves had thought she was his muse. She wasn't. She was the silence between notes, the thing that makes men desperate to fill it. When we left, Lewis said he didn't understand half of what the man meant. I told him that most truths resist explanation. They survive only through suggestion. Back at the station, I spread the evidence before me. Letters, ledgers, fragments of song. The pattern was there, faint but insistent. The benefactor's silence, Marianne's letter, Greaves's final composition, and now this former chorister who refused to sing. Each element, distinct yet harmonically related, like voices in counterpoint. It wasn't what they said that mattered, it was what they omitted. Late that night I returned to the chapel. The doors were unlocked. Someone had been careless or kind. The choir stalls loomed in shadow, their carved figures worn smooth by centuries of devotion. On the lectern lay a copy of the division score. I hadn't seen Rourke carry it, but there it was, 6 staves, 5 voices, 1 left empty. Beneath the blank line he had written, "The missing part must never be sung." Lewis arrived soon after, rain on his shoulders, confusion on his face. I handed him the score. He said it was nonsense, just music. I said nothing. Then I noticed a faint smudge across the empty stave. Not ink, but oil. The imprint of a thumb. Greaves's, perhaps, Marianne's, possibly. Whoever it belonged to, it suggested completion. Someone had touched the unsung line as if to claim it. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him I wasn't sure, that perhaps the choir had always been divided, not by voice but by conscience. Some sing to remember, others to forget. When he left, I stayed a while longer. The air trembled faintly with the echo of something unseen, a chord half-formed, suspended. I found myself humming, not a hymn, but a fragment of that unfinished psalm Greaves had written, the one that never quite resolved. Outside, the bells began to toll for evensong, the sound carried through wet air and empty quadrangles. I listened, as I always did, for the missing harmony. But it never came. Only the division is clear, deliberate, unrelenting between what was sung and what was left to silence. It was near midnight when the call came. The porter at St. Jude's, his voice unsteady with that blend of curiosity and unease peculiar to those who live among scholars, said that someone had broken into the chapel. Nothing taken, nothing damaged, only the organ left playing. I told him to lock the gates and wait. Lewis was already half asleep when I fetched him, and wholly silent as we drove through the dripping streets. The chapel, when we arrived, was awash with candlelight, and a dozen small flames flickering across the pews, their reflections trembling in the polished wood. The organ spoke softly, haltingly, as though the instrument itself were remembering something painful. A woman sat at the bench, Marianne, her coat draped across the stool beside her, her hands pale against the keys. She did not turn as we entered. I told Lewis to wait by the door. She was playing the final variation from Greaves's unfinished work, the one marked Silence. Only now it was no longer silent. A melody wound itself through the chords, hesitant, searching, as if stitched from remorse. She stopped at last and said, almost to herself, that it was wrong to leave anything unfinished. I said, some things are unfinished because they are truer that way. She smiled faintly, a shadow of something like relief. She asked whether we had found the letter Greaves left her. I said we had found many letters, but none addressed to her. She looked at me as though I were testing her, then reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded page. She placed it on the organ lid. The handwriting was unmistakable Greaves's, but fainter, as though written in exhaustion. It began simply to forgive the discord. I could not bear to hear it sung. The note ended there. No signature, no explanation. Beneath the writing, a bar of music, 4 notes, descending incomplete. I traced the intervals in my mind, a fragment from the psalm he had been reworking, ad te levavi animam meam. To thee, O Lord, I lift up my soul. I asked her when she had last seen him. She said the night of the rehearsal. He had come to her room, carrying that very score, and asked her to listen. He played for hours, she said, though his hearing was failing. When the final note faded, he turned to her and said that it was not music anymore, only memory. She had thought he was being poetic. I told her Greaves was rarely poetic, without purpose. Lewis entered then, clearing his throat, uncomfortable with the intimacy of what he'd overheard. He said the vestry door had been unlocked and there were footprints by the window. I nodded. There would always be footprints, I thought, always traces of those who came seeking absolution, too late. When he left, again she turned to me and asked whether I believed in forgiveness. I said I believed in recognition, that most sins require only to be seen. She considered this, then began to play once more. Not Greaves's composition now, but something older than Kyrie. The plea for mercy. Each note is deliberate, restrained. Between the phrases I heard her breathing, unsteady, almost prayerful. As she played, a thought came to me, faint, absurd, yet persistent. I looked again at the folded note. The 4 descending notes matched not the psalm, but the chapel's bell chime. The pattern was unmistakable. Greaves had encoded the time of his death into his music. Midnight, -1. 11 chimes, the hour the porter had sworn he'd last heard the organ that night. Greaves had not been alone. When she stopped, I asked her whether she had gone to him. She said nothing, only closed the lid over the keys with a soft click. Her silence answered better than words. I told her that confession, in the end, changes little, that truth has a habit of arriving too late to be useful. She smiled again, a weary, distant smile, and said perhaps that was why people set it to music, so it might echo longer than it deserved to. Lewis drove her home in the patrol car. I remained, sitting in the front pew, watching the candlelight falter. The organ pipes loomed above me, their shadows stretching upward into the dark vaults, like questions without answers. Before leaving, I unfolded Greaves's note, one last time. The ink had bled slightly where the paper had been folded, the bar lines melting into one another until the final rest became indistinguishable from silence itself. I left it there on the altar, beside the psalter, and stepped out into the damp Oxford night. The bells began to strike 12, each toll carrying that same descending phrase, that same weary cadence. A confession, perhaps not of guilt, but of weariness, the kind that cannot be spoken, only played once and left to fade into the dark. There comes a point in every case, though case is too formal a word, for what this became when what remains is not evidence, but residue. The facts harden, the voices fade, and all that is left is a kind of emotional sediment, fine as dust, impossible to sweep away. It had been a week since Marianne's confession, if confession it could be called. The college had resumed its ordinary rhythms, bells, bicycles, and the slow, inevitable hum of denial. Yet something in me resisted closure, as though the truth, like a final chord, had been struck, but not allowed to resolve. Lewis thought it over, of course. He said as much over coffee that morning, that we'd done what could be done. The file was closed. The coroner was satisfied. I nodded, because agreement costs less than argument. But as he left, I saw him glance back toward the window, where the rain traced crooked paths down the glass. Even he, I think, felt the unease of unfinished music. I walked later to the Bodleian, not from duty, but from instinct. The librarians, as ever, moved with the deliberate quiet of those who believe in order more than grace. I asked for the archive of college correspondences, though I did not expect revelation. What I found was a small but precise letter from Greaves to Sir Alaric Ventham, dated the year before the benefactor's death. It was short, written in Greaves's fastidious hand. You once told me that silence is the cost of beauty. I begin to wonder if it is not also its punishment. That line stayed with me long after I left. Silence. Again. Always silent. The word seemed to haunt this case more than any name, as if each of them, Greaves, Marianne, the choir boys, had been rehearsing its variations. I recalled the score found in the chapel, the one marked Variation 8, Silence. Perhaps that was the confession, not the letter, not the note, not the whispered remorse in candlelight. Just the absence. At dusk I found myself once more at St. Jude's. The porter greeted me with the weary deference reserved for those who linger too long near ghosts. The chapel was unlocked. I entered quietly, as one enters memory. It was colder than I remembered. The scent of polish and damp hymnals filled the air. The organ stood open, the pipes dark against the dying light. I sat in the front pew, my hands folded, though I cannot say in prayer. On the lectern lay the Psalter again, open to Psalm 88. O Lord God of my salvation, I have cried day and night before thee. It was an unchosen psalm. I knew the verger left the selection to chance. Yet I wondered if chance was ever innocent. For a long while I listened not to music, but to the quiet. There is a frequency in silence if one stays still enough. I could almost hear it, that faint, unresolved hum between existence and regret. Somewhere behind me the chapel door creaked. I turned, half expecting her Marianne, or some echo of her, but it was only Lewis, his outline blurred in the gloom. He said he'd been thinking, that he couldn't sleep. I said insomnia was the detective's curse. He sat beside me awkwardly, his hands clasped like a schoolboy's. After a while he asked whether I believed Greaves had meant to die. I told him intention was the hardest thing to prove or forgive. Then, after a pause, I added that men like Greaves rarely intend anything completely. They drift toward their endings like a note held too long. Lewis looked toward the organ loft. He said the choir was to be disbanded, due to too much scandal, too little funding. I said perhaps that was mercy. He frowned, as if unable to tell whether I meant it. When he left, I remained. Outside, the rain had begun again, slow and deliberate. I watched the drops slide down the window pane and thought of Greaves's unfinished composition, the one that had no final bar. I realized, with a small, reluctant clarity, that it did have an ending he had written in the lives of others. Marianne's silence, Rourke's refusal, the choir's fractured harmonies. The music had not stopped, it had simply dispersed. Before leaving, I struck a single key on the organ. The note trembled in the air, pure, uncertain, and for an instant I thought I heard another voice join it, faint, distant, impossible, perhaps imagination, perhaps memory. Then it was gone, absorbed back into the architecture. Outside, Oxford lay dark and gleaming. The cobblestones shone like polished bones. I walked slowly through the quadrangle, past the dripping arches, past the noticeboard where the choir's name had already been removed. Somewhere, a bell began to toll. 11 again, always 11, the unfinished hour. I paused beneath the gatehouse, listening. The sound was neither comfort nor accusation, only continuity. I lit a cigarette, watched the smoke dissolve in the rain, and thought, not for the first time, that some elegies are written not for the dead, but for the unconfessed.